Which rookie running backs are undervalued in fantasy for the 2025 season? That is what we're talking about today on the RotoViz Fantasy Football Show. My name is Colm Kelly. I am joined today, I'm delighted to say, by JJ Zachariason. You'll know him from litround.com, litround QB on social media. Of course, the Lit Round Fantasy Football podcast, but it's awesome to catch up and dive into the rookies at a fun time because we've obviously done the prospect evaluation. I know you've had the rookie guide and we've worked through all that. We've worked our way from probably February through to the draft. And then we get post the draft, we know where they land. But now we've had a little bit of time for the dust to settle and we can kind of see where the ADPs are setting up for some of these players and maybe where the market is right or potentially wrong, positively or negatively on the running back class, because pretty exciting running back class in general, pretty deep. And that gives a lot of opportunities here for us as fantasy football drafters. But JJ, before we get into the players specifically, welcome into the podcast. Thanks for jumping on. How are you doing this Tuesday morning?
I'm great, man. I'm great. It's always great to chop it up with you. We get to do this about once a year, hopefully once a year when we get to do it. And it's always a pleasure. So thanks for having me.
No problem. So we are going to dive in at the top and work our way down through these guys. It's interesting with the way the ADP also has set this up. It's kind of almost in a set of tiers throughout the ADP itself. And it's interesting when sometimes those tiers maybe don't essentially match draft capital or potentially ranking tiers from that perspective. But Ashton Jeanty is going in round 1. He's the RB4 in drafts across kind of most sites, the FFPC Underdog. Obviously a huge amount of expectation for him coming in, and he kind of became a player where you're like, he's the top running back in the class. And because he was the top running back in the class, when you're doing the preview shows ahead of the NFL draft, you almost bounce past him. You go to the next tier of guy. But now the draft is over. He's with the Raiders and he's going in the top 8 or 9 picks of drafts. What's your expectations now with that landing spot? And do you think he could justify that lofty price in 2025?
Yeah, look, I think that one thing that we should probably establish with any top 5 running back in general is that it's really difficult for them to, live up to that expectation just inherently, right? If you're a top 5 running back, that means that you have to finish, in that range and be viable. And that's just a difficult thing to do. With that being said, I do think that Jeanty makes sense in this spot in drafts. My projections have him around there at this time. That's a median outcome for him, obviously. Obviously there's still some room for growth, and just in terms of what if he is as generational or even more generational than we think. I know in my prospect model and the ZAP model, which goes back to 2011, the only running back in that model that's better than Ashton Jeanty is Christian McCaffrey. So there's obviously, a lot of upside there just from a profile standpoint. They bring in Chip Kelly as offensive coordinator. And we know that historically, he's brought a lot of pace to his offenses. We saw that during his time in Philadelphia. Wasn't as strong pace-wise, or at least plays per game-wise when he was in San Francisco, but they also only won 2 games, which I honestly, when I was looking up Chip Kelly stuff a couple weeks ago, I totally forgot that he was even in San Francisco because it was such a short stint. And it was just so pathetically devastating and depressing. So, but the bottom line is you match Chip Kelly with a Pete Carroll mentality, which is run the football, and hopefully play good defense. And eventually maybe the Raiders will get there. But you combine that, and then you look at that backfield, and the backfield, not to say that another running back is going to dig into a generational talent like Ashton Jeanty's workload. But, there will be instances like we saw with Bijan Robinson when he came out, where Tyler Algier was a capable running back and a good enough early down back that he could dig into that workload a little bit. You look at what's going on in Vegas, and there's just not a lot, right? We're not excited about any of the running backs that are behind Ashton Jeanty. And so that's another plus to his projection. And then I think the question also is, which running back are you going to take over him? I mean, obviously, there's wide receivers you might prefer. Fine, if you want to go that route, if that's more of your strategy and your go-to, in that area of the draft. But if you look at it, I people are understandably going to be scared off of Christian McCaffrey. I'm not as scared off of Christian McCaffrey, but people will be scared off of CMC for the injury stuff. And then after that, I mean, after CMC, you get into question mark running backs. So I think that naturally this is where Jeanty should probably be going. I'm fine with taking him where he goes in drafts. It just depends on sort of what I want to approach my draft with in terms of going either wide receiver or running back heavy, to start the draft, or getting him as the anchor and then going wide receiver heavy has been an approach that I've taken in getting him. But yeah, I mean, I think that where he's going makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I do think you mentioned Christian McCaffrey. He's going as the next running back, but then you get into Achane, Derrick Henry, Jonathan Taylor, Bucky Irving, obviously had a massive season last year, Josh Jacobs. There become some scenarios where there is more question marks. So I think in terms of the ranking, I might have Christian McCaffrey, one spot up and him one spot back. But the tricky thing does become like, do you want him or Malik Neighbors, or do you want him or Puka Nacua? They're kind of the decisions you have to make at that point, or even the likes of a Trey McBride. But I feel like in the slot he's in, it's between him and Neighbors or Puka Nacua. And that's a pretty tricky decision at the back of drafts. But the other thing with ADP this year that I've been talking about on these shows is the way that running backs in general are being drafted is kind of what we have been kind of talking about for the last, 10 years, like the way it should be set up. The guys who are like, going to sink your team are now going multiple rounds later rather than in the third round. So I think ADP is pretty well shaped up in the majority of situations. But when we move into the next tier then of running backs, they're going in the kind of 15 to 20 range. That's Omarion, Hampton, TreVevon, Henderson, and RJ Harvey. Just to start it off before we get into like the areas that they're going and who maybe you'd like overall, how are you ranking those guys for this season, and what was your kind of thoughts on them coming in? And I'm going to say this even pre-landing spot, because I think they all have pretty interesting landing spots talent-wise.
Yeah, I'd say, as prospects, I liked Hampton a good bit. I had him as the top of these three, then TreVevon, and then RJ Harvey. I didn't mind RJ Harvey pre-draft, but I think that the only reason that he's in this discussion is because of the landing spot at the end of the day, and because of the draft capital that was a little bit better than expected. But, if he got end of second round draft capital to a more moderate destination, I would argue that he would still not be in this conversation. Like the main reason that we're, discussing him as part of this trio is because obviously he went to Denver. So as players, if I were to just strictly look at that, I do think that it's Hampton, then Henderson, then Harvey. It's really hard to get away from that first round capital of Hampton. Hampton had a lot of good traits in terms of his size, speed combo. He still actually had a pretty decent receiving profile, all things considered. I think that was a piece that folks, weren't necessarily in love with. I didn't mind it with the metrics that I look at. TreVevon Henderson obviously has a great receiving, or has great receiving upside, really good in pass pro. And that, Henderson's the kind of running back that I fall in love with, bias from a bias standpoint, just like a solid pass catching back who could see more work than what people are projecting on the ground. And when that really comes together, you can get a James Cook plus type season or type player out of TreVevon Henderson. So I like all three of these guys. For redraft though, I do think it's a little bit different and things do shift a little bit.
Yeah, so when we get into that conversation, it's interesting with the Harvey conversation. I tend to agree, even though I've been probably, one of the most vocal on terms of I want to have him on as many teams as possible. But I do agree part of that is, he's landed with Sean Payton and the Broncos, and we've still been chasing, some of those New Orleans Saints running back rooms with Sean Payton now in Denver, and they have not materialized. But the hope is now that somebody like a Harvey could come in and do that on a team that may be heading in the right direction. But TreVevon Henderson, is there as well for Ramondre Stevenson, so it makes that a little bit more of a question. But the team was a little bit, hesitant, or maybe even go as far as to say out on Stevenson last season with some of the fumbling issues. Out of this group, Hampton's going in the fourth round, and then it goes down to Henderson in the fifth, as well as RJ Harvey. With that, additional round of ADP cost for Hampton, he is though set up in a very advantageous situation, I think. The tricky part there is, do you think there's any concerns with him paired up with Najee Harris there?
Yeah, look, I from a redraft perspective and from looking at these guys in 2025, I like RJ Harvey the most of the three.
So that makes him undervalued then if he's going last out of these guys.
Exactly. I think Harvey is the most intriguing of the three. If you look at Sean Payton offenses since 2011, they've ranked in the top 6 in running back target share every single year that he's been a head coach in the league since 2011, which is absolutely bonkers. Last year, Javonte Williams sees 70 targets in that offense. Now, I don't know if Harvey's an elite pass catcher, but I do think that if you look at what they have on that team, Jaleel McLaughlin is more of a change of pace kind of guy. and not someone that they've relied on over the last 2 years as a receiver. Audric Estime is the definition of a 2-down back. He didn't do much receiving in college, didn't last year either. So I think Harvey had okay enough receiving numbers. Is there somewhat of a concern long term? Yeah, I mean, like if he doesn't show enough year one and he's more of just the default out as the running back catching passes in that backfield, then I do have some concerns long term with Harvey. But this year, I mean, if you look at his competition, I think he's in a really, really good spot to see a strong target share in that offense. And then, you mentioned, Omarion Hampton and Najee Harris being there. I'm maybe concerned about like the front half of the season, because we sometimes see that where running backs, don't necessarily capture their backfield when they have, a solid enough veteran, next to them in that backfield. But I would expect Hampton to slowly, get a larger and larger role as the season goes on, just based on his prospect profile, where they drafted him, and him just really working as a power back in this Greg Roman offense. The one thing I'll say, though, that was kind of interesting when I was researching Roman's offense in general. So he's been offensive coordinator for a while now, in the NFL. Now, granted, he had teams with Lamar Jackson and Colin Kaepernick and Tyrod Taylor. Yeah. So he had these more mobile quarterbacks, and that can sometimes hurt the fantasy value for some of these running backs because the mobile quarterbacks are taking more plays and they're stealing stuff at the goal line as well. And also sometimes we see with mobile quarterbacks, they don't throw to their running backs as much from a target share perspective. And so if you look at these Greg Roman offenses, though, because it even extended into last year with the Chargers, but if you look at these offenses, his average running back target share rank as offensive coordinator in the NFL has been around 26th throughout his time. So it's been very, very low. He's actually never had an offense where his team running backs, so all of the running backs, ranked in the top 10 in PPR scoring. They're usually, so like the way that I see Hampton, like longer term, and like, if you're deciding to go his direction in like a rookie draft or something, I see it more as like he still has an intriguing ceiling, because I think that if he sees enough work in a Greg Roman offense, like he could ball out, see 15 touchdowns and go crazy there. But I think he's more of like he doesn't have the same receiving ceiling as a Harvey does, as even a TreVevon Henderson does. He kind of is more of a floor play than ceiling play maybe in year one. And then, I don't want that to be misconstrued, because a player like Hampton can still hit a crazy ceiling if and when he takes a lot of that goal line work in what should be a decent enough offense, right? I just mean from the standpoint of like predictable ceiling, right? Like where he's seeing a consistent target share, where he's seeing a bell cow workload. That's where my concern is a little bit, is that this Roman offense is very, very, very solid to get a floor for a player, but it hasn't historically been as solid in terms of getting a ceiling. And I know that, when I'm looking at that as like team running back scoring as opposed to individual running back scoring, if he ends up seeing 80% of the team's backfield work and they rank 11th or 12th in running back scoring, then yeah, he's still going to be an RB1 in fantasy. He'll still be very, very good in fantasy. But I do think that just because of what Greg Roman has done historically, it might not be, it's a great fit in real football. It's a great fit in general, but we kind of want these players like an Omarion Hampton, who maybe have more questionable receiving profiles, to find a place like RJ Harvey did, where they would just be fed the easy stuff out of the backfield through the air. And he's just not going to have that in LA.
Yeah, he may be in a situation. I have no doubt that as the season goes on, and probably pretty early in the season, because like Harris came in as a free agent and then he's coming in as a high drafted player, versus like what we seen last year with Bucky Irving and Rashad White, where White had been a running back for the team. They may have had some more connection with him, but I expect him to be the RB1 here. But the good point that you're going through there with the offensive stuff, in terms of like if you are a running back and let's say RJ Harvey, who gets like 12 carries a game but gets 6 targets, versus Omarion Hampton, who's maybe going to get 20 carries per game but gets 2 targets, it's going to make it a lot more difficult to put up those numbers, particularly in PPR. The other part then is he could have a season where he gets into the end zone 16 times, but that is kind of probably at the moment the path to that success. So it's a team that runs a lot but doesn't pass to the running back. And then again, if you're looking at, you kind of mentioned, I think you said like RB11, RB12 range, but like he's going at RB15. It's not like he's at the moment going to smash through that ceiling. So it makes it a little bit difficult in round 4 then to draft him. The other thing I will say is I've been getting, comments from listeners saying that we are talking too positively about RJ Harvey. And I thought then when you mentioned the pre-draft stuff, I was like, oh, maybe this is the time where we temper expectations. But we kind of went the opposite way and said he's the guy that we want in that zone. Next up, there's a kind of cohort in round 6 through 11 where there's quite a few rookie guys going, and they start to like get interesting in that 0 RB style category. But you get Johnson, Judkins, Skattebo. You also get Tuten and Blue, and it's those last three names that we've talked a lot about here on RotoViz so far since the NFL draft. But that cohort in general, I feel like the likes of Johnson in previous years would have been going probably 4 to 5 rounds later, but as drafters have caught up with the fact that, you know, rookies can have early success in the NFL and teams can go in that direction. And I think even more so, people are buying into the Bucky Irving narrative from last year, but something that we've always targeted through our kind of RotoViz teams. But he is now going, you know, in the 6th round and has strong competition from a Jaylen Warren, who's been with that team for quite some time. How are you feeling about this group? And is there anyone that really stands out to you as maybe overvalued or very exciting at the cost that they are?
Yeah, I have a hard time, honestly, like looking at this running back class and looking what we know about rookies in general and how they historically are very good values in redraft and saying that any of these guys are like obviously overvalued. You know, I think you can make an argument for a lot of these guys. You know, are there concerns and red flags for some of these guys? Yeah, I mean, like I can say negative things about each and every one of them in this range. You know, like Judkins being in an offense that is very, very much up in the air, being a sort of more of an early down back than a full bell cow that, you know, from a projecting standpoint as a prospect, you know, he had question marks in his receiving profile. And then obviously they drafted Dylan Sampson too, who, you know, I don't think was that big of a deal to Judkins' fantasy value, but I can understand if someone would. You know, with Cam Skattebo, you're pairing him with Tyrone Tracy, who could very easily play a decent role in that offense. Bhayshul Tuten obviously has a couple guys ahead of him. Kaleb Johnson is Jaylen Warren, and Jaydon Blue is little. You know, like he's not a huge running back that's gonna steal a lot of work. But I'll say, of these guys that I'm gonna be most intrigued with, I honestly think I'm gonna just lean on who I think is an undervalued prospect and who I think could just sort of elevate himself on his depth chart, and that's Bhayshul Tuten. Where I look at what he did, you know, at Virginia Tech and even NCA&T, where, you know, he had a very, very strong receiving profile, obviously has a great size speed combo, you know, best speed score in the class. His top comp in my prospect model was actually Kenneth Walker, from a size, speed, and some of the metrics that I work with perspective. And I think that, you know, if you're obviously gonna be scared of Tuten because
when Walker was coming out, like the big conversation was like, and I know it hasn't worked out to the max for both of these guys, but who was the better running back, him or Breece Hall? Like they were like very high end talents, and then you're getting I know we're not saying it's the exact same player, but that's a big discount on where you would be getting Tuten in the 10th round.
Yeah, 100%. And, you know, look, I'm not, you know, I think that Walker would obviously be more of a high-end outcome, but I also think when you watch those guys and you see what they bring to the table, they're both home run hitting backs. Like Kenneth Walker, his biggest problem, and I've been a critic of Walker in the way that he's performed in the NFL because, yes, he's flashy, and yes, he's great from, you know, like we want those plays, especially from a best ball perspective, but he's a very inconsistent runner play to play. Like he has low success rates. Like he's not the guy. That's why I think that regime drafted Zach Charbonnet is because they wanted someone that was more the literal opposite, more consistent, right? More of that grinder, more of that James Conner type. And so when you look at Tuten, you could say to yourself, okay, well, who would that Charbonnet character or player be? Tank Bigsby is probably that guy, right? And you have ETN on the last year of his deal because they got the 5th year option with him. You know, ETN and Bigsby, or sorry, ETN in particular has been pegged kind of as a pass catcher because of what he was able to do in college, but he's not that much of a pass catcher. He's not this like obvious go-to 15% target share type player. And this regime is not tied to these guys whatsoever. I think that this Jacksonville backfield is up for grabs. And if it's up for grabs, I'm going to be very intrigued by the guy who had 118 speed score, who had a good receiving profile and has decent size and has that home run hitting ability. So I've been leaning his way. Again, I can make positive I'm going to change it up here because Tuten is somebody that we're very excited about, and we are kind of talking the same thing. You know, the backfield's up for grabs, and you know, new coaching staff, and they had links to Bucky and his success last year, and they're probably not going to be afraid of the veterans. And we can give all the positives. Hit me with the negative here, where he's the odd man out. How do we get to that point? Yeah, I mean, look, he might not hit as a prospect. Like he didn't get the same kind of draft capital that Kenneth Walker got. He is a player who, again, is kind of inconsistent play to play. He's more of that home run hitting back. And when those holes aren't there for him, or if he's not able to hit them, then all of a sudden you get a guy who's not giving you the easy yards. And there's a scenario where he just doesn't hit as a player. I like, his top comp was Kenneth Walker, but in the same breath, Darrington Evans was a comp for him, so like, I think that the range of outcomes for Tuten is actually pretty wide, but I'm going to chase ceiling. And I think the ceiling outcome for Tuten far, far outweighs the floor, especially when you're getting him as late as you're getting him. Right. But like, I actually didn't think that I would be, but I'm kind of in on Jaydon Blue too. And I say that because, obviously the situation, first off, smaller running backs.
Similar situations probably with those two backfields. If we look at it, like there's two veterans in front of those two guys who, the pathway to getting up that depth chart, if they come in and they show talent here and, mini camps, rookie camp, and as they head into the preseason of the NFL and they just look faster, they look sharper than the veterans. Like it's easy to see a story of where they then by week 5 are the main guy here in these offenses.
Yeah, and like with Jaydon Blue, like there is correlation between size and ability to handle a huge workload. Like we don't see smaller, like sub 200, into the 190s type. And I'm not saying that you just use that as a threshold, and anything above is fine, anything below is not fine. It's all on a scale. But generally speaking, smaller running backs do see sub 50% running back rush shares consistently. Like we rarely see these guys get high. Even the players that have hit that are smaller in size, a Devon Achane, a James Cook, like these players still aren't seeing, massive workloads on the ground. And so I do think there's that concern for Jaydon Blue, and that concern is always going to be there for Jaydon Blue. With that being said, Javonte Williams has not been himself since his injury. Miles Sanders, I'm not really concerned about because he hasn't been relevant in a couple of years now. I think that what they did was they got Blue as a really solid change of pace, crazy acceleration, really good with the ball in space, can catch passes out of the backfield. He had one of the best receiving profiles, in my opinion, in this class. And they paired him with an early down bruiser in the 7th round in Phil Maffa, who is not going to do anything through the air, but sure, like early down work is relatively replaceable in the NFL. Could Phil Maffa be fine enough as it? Sure. Like it's not, I don't think he's going to be fantasy relevant because he's not going to see any pass catching, but sure, he could play that kind of role. And Javonte Williams obviously can play that role too. I think though that like Blue is in a spot where in most other circumstances, I wouldn't be like aggressive with him necessarily, but my model really liked him, really strong receiver, really strong speed for even for his size. And so I'm going to be intrigued by that because I think that there's a chance that they want to use him similar to how Detroit uses like a Jahmyr Gibbs, not to say that he is Jahmyr Gibbs, or that he would handle as much work on the ground as Gibbs. But yeah, but like that, a Gibbs light workload, and he wouldn't be as good as him either, but a Gibbs light workload could be in store for Jaydon Blue, hypothetically, if things really do hit. I think the most likely outcome is like a Justice Hill. Like that's the probable outcome for a guy like Blue.
The interesting thing, and we're not going to get into it here, is the Gibbs pick is going in that same range as the Jeanty pick in round 1 as the RB3, and it is that like what can you get in round 11 that versus round 1, and you can't really replace those wide receivers, but you might be able to patch together some of the running backs to be able to give you something similar. With those guys we've talked about or touched on so far, obviously we've talked mainly on the guys that you're enthusiastic about. Is there any of those that like for you are basically complete fades in drafts this year?
Not really. I'll say this though, and this kind of extends the Jaydon Blue conversation. I do have some fear that he's a player who could rise a lot as the summer goes on, because these smaller guys who are really flashy, who have crazy speed, they're going to look really good in camps, and they're going to look good, without pads and stuff like that. And obviously there's an opening here for a running back to emerge, and the common fantasy gamer knows that. And so I do have some fear that Blue, I'm trying to be grounded with the Blue take, like where I see an out where there is, this like decent sized, maybe he's like 120 to 130 carry player with a 10 to 12% target share. And then all of a sudden that's really relevant in this kind of offense. Right. But I do think that there is some fear that, people just are a little bit unrealistic about the size profile, and they just steam him up. And then all of a sudden he's a single digit round pick. And that's going to be a little bit scarier.
Yeah, and I talked about this a little bit earlier about how players are being priced, but the likes of a Blue or a Tuten, I do think in previous years would have probably been maybe a 15th round
Right.
player. But because people have got so much sharper, and because best ball drafts and there's money on the line and people are paying to do them, people are having more information where they're drafting. I feel like all those guys now are moved up multiple rounds. So that's people who do the rookie stuff like yourself and then are drafting. That's a little bit less of an advantage, but I still think there's an advantage to drafting, particularly this year's rookie running back class. So what you're kind of saying there is not fading them, but you want to draft them now because the price later might be too expensive for these guys.
Yeah, I'm worried about it. And I'm worried, like even Bhayshul, Tuten, I'm worried about.
They're the two that I'm most worried about. I think that say like Skattebo and Tracy, I think there'll be enough of those guys tethered at a similar ADP where they'll probably stay pretty close to each other, and maybe even Johnson and Warren. But I do think that Tuten and Blue, they could easily get positive. The one good thing about Tuten is he did have a fumble last week in camp, so that might keep it where it is. But I could see positive reports starting to move those guys up the boards.
100%.
As we get ready to close out here in the running backs, is there any running backs beyond kind of that round 11 range that we haven't talked about? Is there some favorite rookie guys that maybe slipped even under the radar for NFL teams? The one thing this year with the NFL draft was that because it was a deep class, there was kind of a range of guys that could go between, round 4, round 7, potentially undrafted. And that was the case then with some of the names that were in those brackets. Is there any of them guys standing out, landing spot talent, that you think you'll want to get on as many teams as possible?
Yeah, obviously in the late rounds, you're looking at backs who are not necessarily going to be in such an ambiguous backfield that they could take over the RB1 spot, right? But you're looking at guys who could maybe firmly entrench themselves as the RB2 on their team. And if there's an injury or if the RB1 just underperforms, then obviously they can step in and do something from a fantasy perspective. A couple guys like that, this isn't the main one that I want to talk about, but a couple guys that I think fit that to some degree. I like Devin Neal a decent bit. He had arguably, top 3-ish production profile in this class. A good size, not the most explosive player, but he can do it all. And that's really attractive when you have, an older running back ahead of him in Alvin Kamara. I don't know no one knows whatever's going on with Kendre Miller at this point. So, I think that Devin Neal is pretty interesting and intriguing. I'm also intrigued by Tahj Brooks to a degree. Now, he didn't score amazingly well in my prospect model. I think his receiving profile, and I care deeply about receiving profiles and receiving numbers just because that seems to be something that we can take advantage of when we're prospecting these running backs. Tahj Brooks didn't really have an unbelievable receiving profile, but again, you look at the guys behind Chase Brown and there's not that much going on. And Chase Brown has only given us one, really strong season, really half a strong season, at the NFL level. I still don't mind Chase Brown, but I think that we have to be realistic that, we haven't seen a massive sample with him. So if you want to throw a last round dart at a guy like Brooks, be my guest. The one guy that I do want to talk about though, in more detail is Jarquez Hunter.
Oh yes. Let's go.
Looked like I would go on shows pre-draft and he was, people would ask me like, oh, who's your favorite, like under the radar dart throw running back? It was always Jarquez Hunter, just over and over and over again. He was top 10 in within this class in metrics like missed tackles forced per rush, explosive run rate. And then you look at the landing spot in LA, and I know that people are going to be turned off because they have Kyren Williams, who is Sean Payton's favorite. They drafted Blake Corum.
I think Jarquez Hunter may be Sean Payton's new favorite.
We'll see. I mean, they draft Blake Corum last year, who didn't really show us much. We don't really know if Blake Corum's good or not yet, just based on last season. Kyren Williams took a step back last year from more of an efficiency standpoint, and he's also in the last year of his deal. And if you look at these players, Kyren Williams, Blake Corum, Jarquez Hunter, 5'9", 5'8", 5'9", weight 194 pounds coming out for Kyren Williams, 205 for Blake Corum, 204 for Jarquez Hunter. If you look at so I use a metric in the ZAP model called breakout score, which is simply looking at receiving yard. This is only for running backs, or I guess it's for running backs and wide receivers. I look at receiving yards per team pass attempt, and I adjust that for strength of opponent as well as age. So it's age and schedule adjusted receiving yards per team pass attempt. Jarquez Hunter had the best breakout score of those three. So Kyren Williams was at 90, which is solid. It's out of 100. Blake Corum was at 40, around 40. Jarquez Hunter was at 93.8. He didn't have a crazy reception share in college, but when he did see the rock, as a receiver. He was incredibly efficient. Speed score, he separates himself from those two guys. He's easily the most explosive of those guys. If you look at his career explosive run rate in college, 23.8%. The other two were 13 and 12%. I mean, he's like a more explosive version of what they have right now on that roster. Now, he might not be as good. We'll see, like just as a pure runner. And Kyren Williams is obviously surprised. And I think he's just gotten better as a player versus what we saw, as a prospect and then at the combine. But I think there's a chance that Jarquez Hunter takes over as that RB2, over Corum. And then if Kyren Williams gets hurt, or what if I think when they drafted Blake Corum last year, they had a vision of doing what the McVay tree kind of does, which is not rotate running backs by down and distance and, get a third down back in there. He likes this tree likes to rotate more by drive. And I think that they ideally wanted a scenario last year where it was 2 drives on for Kyren, 1 drive off, Blake Corum steps in. Well, what happens if they do that and they really deploy that and Jarquez Hunter steps in and he sees work and all of a sudden he's great and he's explosive and he's doing all the things that we liked about him as a prospect? There's a scenario here where he just naturally sees a little bit more work than we expect. And then all of a sudden, what if Kyren Williams gets hurt? Or what if these other outcomes happen and he could be a league winner at the end of the day if things do break his way?
Yeah, I think you're really getting this hype there for Hunter. I think this is the tier of running backs I think is really mispriced when we get down into kind of the 15th, 16th round. You mentioned Devin Neal, Brashad Smith, somebody else who I think is very interesting is going next to him, Jarquez Hunters. They're 3 running backs going back to back to back. And then even like you mentioned, Tahj Brooks, he's going 2 rounds later. But there is quite a few rookie running backs in that tier that I think like you'll want to be potentially even getting 2 of those guys in as many rosters as you can. I think it's an interesting zone where even you mentioned like a Kyren Williams just going in the 3rd round. I don't think it's outrageous to say that like that could be this year's Bucky Irving, Rashad White kind of scenario where he could be usurped. And I also think on the Corum thing, he was somebody I was hopeful for last year, but I think that the team with how you mentioned the plan and how that plan then played out throughout the season, I don't think it's a situation where they thought that he was the guy to go and do it. So it's concerning for him entering his 2nd year. But that is where we finish up the running backs. I think we covered a lot of ground there on the rookie guys. Hopefully it'll help people out in their drafts. JJ, I mentioned to start, they can follow you on Twitter at LateRoundQB. You have the LateRound.com and of course the podcast. But anything you want to highlight that people can check out over the coming days or weeks?
Yeah. Everything's on lateround.com. I'm selling the prospect guide still. It gives you all the scores for these guys that I've, in my prospect model, I do write-ups for them too. And then my draft guide is now available for pre-order. That's more of a game theory driven kind of draft guide. But yeah, that's all that'll launch on July 1st. But it's all the details are on lateround.com.
Awesome. Check that out. The thing with the rookie guides is people sometimes think the draft's over, no need for rookie guides. The information that guys like yourself or that Sean with the RotoViz rookie guide put into these guides, it will help you. Even like I have sometimes people reach out when it gets to, the next off season. People are like, can you give me a copy of last year's rookie guide? Because they want to see these guys then going into year 2. So the information is very much sought after. So check out JJ's guide as well. That is where we're going to close it out. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on socials at Overtime Ireland. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast to get it once it is available. Until we are back, have a good one.